Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in good spirits wherever you are in the world, and my warmest regards to you during this time. So, continuing with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter, please allow me to talk to you, share with you some thoughts that I have about a very interesting and peculiar work within the context of the filmography of John Carpenter. This is actually a very interesting film, and I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about it. The film is from 1992, and it is called Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Memoirs of an Invisible Man from 1992 stars Chevy Chase and Daryl Hannah, and it is a very interesting and peculiar work within the context of Carpenter's career. This film is, in essence, it's a science fiction film with some slight elements of horror to it, but it's all in all pretty much it's a science fiction film with a kind of caper element to it, a man on the run element to it, which also adds tones of thrillers and suspense. There are certain traits of cinema that I would say are borrowed quite heavily and quite lovingly, for example, from the works of Alfred Hitchcock and others from the classical cinema tradition. It is also a film that is a special effects it's a special effects extravaganza in many ways, because considering the time it was released, the early 1990s, and considering that this time was the time where computer graphic effects as used in mainstream films was really becoming more prominent and really getting a great prominence in these sorts of big budget films. It's really interesting to see this kind of effects being employed at this relatively early stage in their development, and they're done very well and very effectively for the most part, and I look forward to talking about those hopefully in more detail later. And there is also, of course, a thriller element, as I mentioned, but also an espionage element. There is elements of government spycraft and paranoia. There are also elements of comedy and humor. There are also romantic elements that, as I indicated, borrow quite lovingly from the traditions set forth by Alfred Hitchcock and the early Hitchcock thriller romance traditions and the like. So in many ways, this film has a lot going for it, and it has a lot of spirit and a lot of heart. And even though it might seem on the surface to have things about it that are not consistent with many of the films in Carpenter's canon, I think one can maybe reasonably argue, at the very least, that this film has quite a strong set of connections with Carpenter's works, and I will try to get into that with a little bit more detail in the latter half of this video. The Blu-ray that I have here is the Japanese Blu-ray release of this film, and it is a kind of standard Blu-ray release. It does have certain features to it in the sense that it has the documentary, or very short documentary, about 4 minutes, which is called How to Become Invisible, The Dawn of Digital Effects. And it also has a section which is kind of deleted footage or unused scenes that are just that are sort of extra parts of scenes that are already included in the film. So these are sort of extra things that we see in this sort of collection of outtakes, as it were. And then there's a trailer, theatrical trailer there, and the film presentation on this Blu-ray is a high definition presentation. So it's still very good, but I would suggest that perhaps the Shout Factory release is slightly more superior. But still, it's better to have this from my own personal library, and me being in Japan, that it was very convenient to get this, with the hopes perhaps that maybe one day in the future there might be an even more packed special edition of this film. Hopefully, fingers crossed, you never know. But in any event, my friends, this is available here in Japan. Obviously, it's also available in North America, in case you are interested, as well as the possibility of seeing it in other forms. But this is the Japanese Blu-ray that I have and that I rely upon. With that, my friends, let me now say that I will be talking about this film with a little bit more detail, spoilery detail. And so if you have not seen this film, please, I would suggest that you turn off this video now, and you can watch this film and then come back at any time, and at which time it'll be my pleasure, of course, to hear your thoughts and comments about this most interesting work, which is called Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Okay, so you're back, which means that you don't mind going into a somewhat detailed discussion of this film, Memoirs of an Invisible Man. And I think from the outset we can say that there are many elements to this film that seem to be unlike most of John Carpenter's earlier works, in the sense that, on the surface anyway, and based off of, for example, certain materials that have been written about this film after the fact, certain other articles or any other materials or research materials of that nature, it would seem that on the surface anyway, John Carpenter at this point in his career was sort of looking for a project, and this happened to come along, which was essentially a product developed through the traditional mechanisms of the Hollywood cinema machine. And as a result, it might seem like a film that, when compared to other works by John Carpenter, might not necessarily have, in every aspect of the cinematic frame, a stamp of John Carpenter's cinematic craft. In other words, on the surface, it might seem to some anyway that this film might appear to be a film that seems closer to a work for hire project from John Carpenter rather than a film by John Carpenter. And of course we can see this in the aspect that the music isn't by John Carpenter, it's by a different composer. We have a different cinematographer that is being employed here, so it's not the usual cinematographer that John Carpenter was working with during this period, Gary Kibbe and the like. And so there are aspects that might seem therefore to be different than John Carpenter's filmography. However, even with those points in mind, I would actually suggest that this film, regardless of its specific production history details, I think holds a lot of great connections with the works of John Carpenter in the past, to the extent that I think this can still, of course, legitimately be deemed to be a John Carpenter film, not only in name, but also in spirit. For example, the idea of the relationship between these two characters, the Chevy Chase character and the Daryl Hannah character, Nick and Alice, I think form the very heart and soul of this film. And it's through this relationship that we can really begin to understand and sympathize with the plight of Nick, the Chevy Chase character, and really understand what it is he's going through and why it is he wants to do what it is he wants to do. He wants these. He wants a kind of a relationship and all the wonders of a relationship that one would come to expect from this kind of thing, but he can't have it because of a certain situation, namely he has become invisible through some kind of freak accident at a sort of scientific based lab or a building or headquarters. And so therein lies the crux of the story, of course. But the heart and soul of the story is this relationship. And I think because we can feel and appreciate the kind of attraction that these two have for one another, I think that helps to propel the story forward. Now, of course, this is still a quote-unquote Hollywood film, and there are certain aspects to even the romance story between these two characters that might seem a little bit far-fetched. For instance, they do seem perhaps to have a very close connection almost immediately, and so there isn't necessarily that tension of them getting to know each other and the like, but I think that is also a kind of cinematic shorthand that is employed by John Carpenter and also the writers and also the other filmmakers to get the story moving along, and I can completely understand that. And also there is this more fundamental tension between these two characters. The tension comes not from the sort of the idea of will they fall in love or won't they? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that they will fall in love, but the tension comes from the fact that how exactly will this relationship work because of the fact that Nick is invisible. How will that work? What are the ramifications of that, and what are the realistic challenges that come from this sort of relationship if you really carry it through to its sort of logical conclusion? And so I think that's where the source of the fascination of this comes in, and also the fact that they are earnestly, the characters anyway, they're earnestly sort of into each other, and I think that adds a sense of urgency and also heart, which I think gives this film a really nice edge to it. It reminds me a lot of John Carpenter's earlier work, Starman, and how there was at the heart of that film the relationship, which was the emotional core that allowed us, the audience, to really believe those characters and follow those characters and really want them to succeed. Well, I think something similar is happening here with Memoirs of an Invisible Man, and I think to a certain degree anyway, I think there is a level of success that we can find in this film with respect to that emotional core that we have here. And I think also from that emotional core we can find that, I think that's very important because, the character of Nick Holloway, the Chevy Chase character, I think is acknowledged from the outset and from the people and how the people around him think about him. He's acknowledged as being a kind of not wholly likable person from the get-go. He only grows into a more likable person and a sort of credible hero to the proceedings only after he becomes invisible through this huge mishap that happens due to, a cup of coffee being spilled on a keyboard, and everything just goes just berserk, right, in the laboratory, but which is another great cinematic little thing that happens, like one little drop of coffee and the whole building becomes almost invisible. So that's an interesting little cinematic shorthand as well, in terms of how laboratories in movies work out versus real life, of course. But the point that I was trying to bring up is that with Nick, two things happen, I think, that make him a very likable hero, because he is otherwise not the most wholly likable person when he starts out the film, but he becomes sympathetic in our eyes, I think, because one, he becomes invisible through this accident, and two, I think because he sort of gets to appreciate the faults that he had in his regular life, and he, I think, begins to realize the good things in life that he now misses because he is now invisible. And I think that is played through quite gracefully and with a nice sense of metaphor in vis-a-vis his relationship with Alice, the Daryl Hannah character, and the kinds of human needs and feelings that he has, but he cannot cannot necessarily acquire or feel or get a sense of simply because of his physical state. And so it makes him as a character really try to appreciate, or really begin to appreciate, the things in life that he perhaps took for granted before all this stuff happened to him. And so I like that progression. I like how he is not necessarily the most likable person to start with. He's not wholly unlikable, don't get me wrong, but there's a nice sense of growth in that, by virtue of his becoming the way he is, he seems to gain also a sense of self-awareness, which is, I think, also really great. It's a kind of self-awareness that is almost reminiscent of other characters in John Carpenter films of a similar vein. In particular, someone like Jack Burton, who I think in Big Trouble in Little China has a really strong sense of self-awareness, and I think that enables him to always maintain a down-to-earth quality. And I think something similar is going on with Nick Holloway, the Chevy Chase character, to a certain degree anyway. So I like how that there's a certain progression, and the characters aren't necessarily one note, so to speak. Speaking of the characters, there's also the great performance by Sam Neill as the very devious antagonist of the film, David Jenkins. And I just love the name David Jenkins, and just has this presence to it. I'm not sure, and Sam Neill's performance here is quite something else. There is a real urgency that is bordering on a real malicious, malevolent sort of behavior. Almost uncontrollable, as it were, and the things that he will do to try to obtain his goals are sometimes quite frightening. And I think Sam Neill gives it that sense of, what's the phrase, gravitas, and real menace, which I think is well needed, and really gives the film a real hard-lined edge of suspense and urgency, which is really, I think, quite valuable in a film like this. What's amazing about the film also, in terms of the way it's structured, is the fact that even though we have this story about a man on the run being chased by the authorities, trying to get answers, trying to basically save himself and save his existence, really, and just try to do many things at once, because there are many different actors at play here. But what's amazing is that even in the context of this kind of thrilling entertainment ride, it goes from one set piece to another set piece and to another, and one chase scene to another chase scene that involves these great special effects and the like, of him being invisible, etc. I think there is a kind of ingenuity of the plot, in that around the middle of the film, the plot really slows down, because there's a point where he goes to a certain beach house, which is away from the city area, away from the central area of San Francisco. And he goes to this beach house basically to hide out and to just take a breather and take a break, and try to gather his thoughts and really come up with a plan of how to deal with this particular situation. And he goes there, and this is where the whole secondary plot develops with the Michael McKean character, and then Daryl Hannah comes back, and that furthers the romance plot between the two characters, the Daryl Hannah character and the Chevy Chase character, and certain romantic hijinks ensue, as it were. But the film really slows down, because there's no Sam Neill element here, at least directly intertwined with this particular part of the plot anyway. And so it takes a nice breather, and I really appreciate that. It doesn't go from one set piece to another set piece to another set piece. It doesn't go necessarily from one special effect to another special effect to another special effect. No, it takes a middle chunk of the film and it just slows down and takes a breather almost for the sake of developing the romance between the two leads, which I find to be a very ingenious choice, and it further adds weight to the assertion that their relationship forms the emotional heart and soul of the film. So I really admire that very much, and it also gives room for sort of comic elements, Michael McKean, etc., and the like. So I really appreciate how it sort of slows down and is willing to take its time, and then it picks up again in the final act of the film with Sam Neill and everything coming to a head in the city. And so that's a really interesting structure to it. And given all this stuff that happens in the film, we do have, of course, one of the centerpieces of the film being the special effects work, and in particular, how to depict the invisible man stuff on screen. And this is done through a number of different techniques that I think are combined quite well. There are techniques involving actual computer graphic effects that are meant to sort of simulate what it would look like to have an invisible man smoking a cigarette, or maybe chewing bubble gum, or doing something along those lines. And we see that, to a certain degree anyway, sort of play out. So there's that. And then we also have the invisible man taking off clothes and running around and being chased. So we have this thrill chase espionage element combined with the special effects element to create not only a tense moment, but also a moment of a special effects spectacle. So there, and also a moment that will propel the plot forward to a certain degree anyway. And this seems very much in keeping with past John Carpenter works that had a similar combination. Once again, Big Trouble in Little China comes to mind. Escape from New York also comes to mind. So there are these elements to that as well. But the special effects don't end there, because there are also some interesting ways in which mime is used, pretending that something is there but it's actually not there. So pretending that there's kind of a space there, or a person that's represented within that space, but in fact no one is there. Sam Neill in particular does this very well, and I love how sometimes Sam Neill character is talking, and it's really just talking to air, talking to nothing, but we know that Chevy Chase is around there somewhere. It's a really nice moment. Incidentally, there's early on in the film, I love how there's a reference made to Harvey, which is another, I think, classical cinema reference that's made. Yes, so there's certain mime techniques that are used, and also there are other sort of prop techniques that are used in terms of using clear glass to represent invisible walls or the like. And then also there's a nice visual trick or leitmotif, if you will, of sometimes seeing Nick, the Chevy Chase character, actually there, but the conceit is that he is invisible to everyone else. And so we as audience members sometimes see him in the scene, but then it's understood that no one else in the world of the film can see him. And so I like that cinematic interplay, that we sometimes see him on screen, sometimes we don't. It's very easy, therefore, for us to register where it is he is physically in the space of the scene, but also it's nice to keep in touch with who Nick is and what kind of character he is in the context and in the moment. And so that kind of that exchange between scenes where he is invisible versus scenes where he is visible to us, the viewers, I think it's very helpful and keeps us registered in the moment. And then, of course, there are other ways in which that is played out through the use of makeup, through the use of over-applied makeup, or through the use of clothing. The bandit scene, which is a famous scene, which is also harkening back to early cinema with the Invisible Man, etc. And the like. So those sorts of techniques are combined very well and very interestingly to form, as I say, a film that has layers of special effects extravaganza elements to it, but then also underneath it, it's anchored by really nice performances here, and I think a story with a heart and soul. Speaking of performances, I have to mention, of course, Chevy Chase. I think a lot of maybe criticism was made against this film, I think part because the fact that Chevy Chase was in it meant that there might have been the expectation that this was meant to be a really overt comedy or comic film, given his reputation as a really funny comedic actor during this time, or maybe up to this point, more so in the 80s, but this was early 90s, of course. But I think what he gives in terms of his performance is really it's really quite interesting indeed, because I think he's almost channeling the great film noir traditions. You know, sometimes when I see Chevy Chase on screen, or when I hear him speak, and he has that, of course, he also speaks in terms of the voiceover narration throughout the entire film, or throughout most of the film anyway, because most of the film's conceit is him talking invisible in a chair to a videotape, to a video camera. So I like that kind of delivery he gives, because it's borrowing, I think, quite heavily from the film noir tradition. I mean, it's almost like it's like the start of the film Double Indemnity or something. And I like that even the tone of his voice in the narration feels like a kind of a private eye detective sort of tone of voice to him, and the way and the cadences and the way that he pronounces certain words and rhythms in his speech patterns, etc. So I like how this is borrowing from a kind of film noir cinematic tradition, which is, again, another kind of trait which we see from John Carpenter a lot in his past films, you know, the combining and blending of various different cinema genres to form one new sort of unit of John Carpenter entertainment. And you know, if indeed, if we remember, or if indeed there were contemporary critics at the time who criticized this film for not being clear as to what it was trying to be. Was it trying to be a comedy, or was it trying to be an adventure film? Was it trying to be a fantasy sci-fi film or something like that? But I think that's part of its strength, to be perfectly honest, and it's what I was trying to allude to just now, namely that John Carpenter as a filmmaker is known for blending many genres into one film, and I think this is a really prime example of that. You know, I mentioned film noir, I mentioned sci-fi, I mentioned The Invisible Man, I mentioned references to Harvey, etc. I think also, I also mentioned earlier Hitchcock. There are many references here to Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, I think the fact that it's set in San Francisco harkens back to Vertigo, of course. There's one scene in particular where we see Nick hanging off of a ledge from the second story, and we see him hanging down below, and below him we see a spiral sort of staircase. That always reminded me. It's not an absolutely perfectly direct reference, of course, but it does have a certain visual flair that really reminds me of Vertigo and James Stewart hanging off of a ledge in Vertigo. So that's another Alfred Hitchcock connection that can be made. And also, there are also connections made to Hitchcock and also to other cinematic traditions like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, etc. When we see places that are mentioned in the film, you know, Santa Mira is mentioned, Bodega Bay is mentioned, and of course, being, you know, in this California, San Francisco vicinity. So these elements, I think, of harkening back to older cinematic traditions, and many of them at that, and combining them into one sci-fi action adventure film, I think it's what makes this film very charming and very effective. And so rather than be in any way a detriment or a weakness to the film, I think these combination of these many elements, I think, are what forms many of the strengths of the film. So, and it's something that, as I say, is what we have seen from John Carpenter in the past. So, in that sense, this is a very consistent film in the context of John Carpenter's filmography, even though we do have elements that might seem different. I mean, the music is one place where I think we do see a certain style of music that we haven't seen in most of John Carpenter's work up to now. But we have seen instances where John Carpenter's films occasionally do have music from other musicians, or other musical composers, and not just John Carpenter. And we'll see a kind of return to that in a later films by John Carpenter. But that's to say that just because there's another composer involved in the music, that doesn't mean that this is any less a John Carpenter film. Let me put it that way. Of course. There's something very special and wonderful about the John Carpenter music, don't get me wrong, but I would say that even the music here is quite effective as a kind of Hollywood entertainment sort of way. It does hit the beats where it should, and it does have a certain sense of scale and adventure where it should, and it has a kind of quieted down tone where it should. So I find those elements very effective. So there is that. And I suppose one could also say that in terms of the concepts that are being presented here, of course we do have this idea of sort of existential threat, this time in the form of becoming invisible, and how the act of becoming invisible, or the accident that leads to invisibility, and the actual existence in terms of being invisible, how that actually affects one's character and identity, and also existence, and also one's notion of being in existence and being alive. And this is done quite skillfully in these very almost pensive scenes that Chevy Chase has, where he's trying to work out the sort of physics and the physics related consequences of certain actions that he tries to undertake when he is walking around. He doesn't necessarily get his bearings right the first time. He has to remember that he is invisible, and so he has to remember that things he holds are usually visible, but his actual body that's holding the thing is not. There's an interesting interplay about clothing. The clothes that he wore during the accident are also invisible, but that means also that other types of clothes are not. So when he's wearing other clothes, it looks like it's just a floating shirt or a floating pair of pants or something. But there is that sort of element of cinematic physics, let me put it that way. And that also goes into the physics of what happens when an invisible man smokes a cigarette, what happens when an invisible man eats, what happens when other sort of bodily functions come into play, and and what are the consequences and ramifications of that. The film ends at a very interesting and peculiar place. We understand that Nick and Alice are now together. They have somehow escaped their predicament in the film, and they are now perhaps the understanding is perhaps there will be another member of the family coming very soon, and we never see how this will play out. And so it's obviously very interesting to consider what the consequences of their union will be, and how that will play out in sort of real life explorations, if you will. So so the film, in other words, it doesn't go into a full explanation of this, but it goes sort of just enough to lay the groundwork for further speculation on the part of the viewer as to what might happen here, what might happen there, what happens if this certain circumstances arises, what happens if that certain circumstance arises, etc. It doesn't go fully into certain consequences and ramifications, etc. But and also leaves room for the possibility for more. I mean, I could have seen, if this film were, let's say, if more people were interested, then I would probably say that it's possible to see, let's say, another sequel, a direct sequel to this, where we actually see what happens after, the idea is that Nick and Alice will have a child. So what happens to the child as he or she grows up, and what are the physical traits of that particular child, etc. Their possibilities are many. So I would think that this film at least opens up the possibility of the exploration of the universe further, and the physical, the exploration of the physical attributes and the actual struggles of being invisible. A very interesting start to that kind of conversation, which I think has a potential for having even more carry through beyond the film. But as far as the film goes, I think it does a kind of an interesting job, both in terms of setting forth a kind of comic element to that particular situation, as played by Chevy Chase, of course, but also adding a sense of pathos and a sense of sadness and loneliness, which is also set forth in the performance by Chevy Chase, which gives his performance, I think, a lot of layered nuance. So I think that's wonderful, and it's all in the context of exploring this idea of being invisible, right? Because it's the ultimate expression in many ways of being alone, of being without any company. And so to deal with loneliness and to deal with this kind of paranoia that's also about because you realize that the government is after you. I think that also is a kind of link back to John Carpenter's film past. We've seen this in like films like They Live, The Thing, and the like. And so Nick Holloway in many ways is very linked to MacReady or Roddy Piper's Nada, etc. So this is, I think, the more I think about it, the more I realize that this is a film that is so consistent with the past works of John Carpenter. For example, through the exploration of being invisible vis-a-vis this particular main character of Nick Holloway, played by Chevy Chase. So I think that makes this film very much worthy of a discussion in the John Carpenter canon filmography. Also, it does explore other themes, not only the theme of loneliness and solitude, but also the theme of sort of government-induced paranoia, kind of like a Big Brother sort of feel to it, but it's more along the lines of spycraft and government agents, etc., trying to suppress a kind of government secret, that sort of thing. And there is therefore a sense of paranoia and a sense of almost hopelessness, or fighting against the worst possible odds. And this is also hearkening back to films that we've seen before, to some extent Prince of Darkness, but I think to even a greater extent films like I think of government paranoia and government surveillance as well. I think we can add films like Escape from New York and They Live, etc., as being prime examples of that. So in that sense, this aspect of the film as personified by Sam Neill's character, I think, makes this film also linked to other films of John Carpenter's past. So this is, I think, a much more consistently John Carpenter film than perhaps people at the time gave it credit for. And so these themes, I think, are layered in. But ultimately, I think what this film does well and does best is act as a science fiction entertainment. There are moments of real entertaining spectacle, and we see this in the way that he gets out of situations by utilizing his invisible nature and quality, how he is using his smarts and trying to work out a plan to get out of this or deal with this, in terms of trying to make profits on the stock market, or using decoys in order to get away and to rescue Alice from the authorities at the very end, and using the invisibility to his effect, and also using it to his advantage when, for instance, when he's in the beach house and everyone is talking kind of badly about him, not knowing that he's actually there. He actually does a little mischief and makes things spill and that sort of thing. So he does have fun with this invisible stuff when he can, but it also, as I say, it allows for a showing of his tender side, because it allows for the development of his character from maybe not the most likable character at the beginning to someone that I think we can root for, and set against the context of themes that we have seen in John Carpenter's past, like government paranoia and surveillance, and also the discussion of loneliness and solitude and the effects it has on not only on the human psyche, but also on one's sense of being in existence and one's sense of one's existence. existence. And I think therein lies, I think, a very potentially profound kind of cinema discussion with respect to that kind of theme. And then, of course, as all this is happening, we have links not only to cinematic past with Hitchcock and film noir, etc., science fiction, but we also have links to John Carpenter's past. So therefore, I think this film, Memoirs of an Invisible Man, is much more than meets the eye. Even when what meets the eye might be invisible, it certainly is more than meets the eye, because it is, I think, a very strong, entertaining work by John Carpenter. I do acknowledge that I think for many people this film is probably not considered the best work directed by John Carpenter, and I can completely understand that. I think that perhaps for a lot of people, this film is sort of minor John Carpenter entertainment. I know that there have been certain stories reported on about the production details and the production history and what actually happened behind the scenes, and the actors and how the performances were how they were elicited, or what action happened on the set, etc. I know that there are certain stories about this as well, so there might be some stories about that could affect one's viewing of this film. But be that as it may, still, as a kind of film product in and of itself, I think it works very, very well. And it's thrilling, it's entertaining, it's suspenseful, it's romantic, it's tragic, it's funny, and it's quite glowing. And it does have links with John Carpenter, in terms not only of people that we might recognize. There's a great cameo, for instance, by Donald Lee of Big Trouble in Little China fame, as a taxi driver. So that's another nice link to a John Carpenter past. But I think also, in terms of theme, there are links to John Carpenter's filmography that I was trying to explain earlier. So in all these respects, I think this film is a worthy John Carpenter film. It might not necessarily be the most emblematic of John Carpenter's style, given its production background and history, but still it is, I think, undeniably a very, very good John Carpenter film, and one that I think is worth exploring, either on its own merits or in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. This is the film Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Okay, so that's it for now. So what do you think? If you have any thoughts or comments about this film, please, as always, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I would always love to hear what it is you have to say. So thank you very much for your time, and until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time, and my friends, cheers.